Well, it's that time again. Time for me to do another Star Trek video that I put just that little teensy-weensy amount of effort into. It's not only not actually a Trek Actually video, it's a not actually Trek Actually comment response video, where you have done, I won't say all the work, but a certain percentage of the work for me, for which you are to be compensated in no way whatsoever. Thank you very much, and God bless the American dream. This first batch of questions comes from my most recent Star Trek-related video, the one I did about the musical instruments in Star Trek. This first one is from Jonathan Wines 2542. Musicians playing clarinet and saxophone interchangeably is fairly common in the professional scene. It has its roots back in early jazz, when the sax players would frequently play clarinet or flute when it was required. Also, the mechanics of the two are fairly similar. You might not be able to be a master at both at the same time, but if you're really good at one, you can pick up the other reasonably well if you try. The point is, they establish one of their characters with this hobby, with this trait, with this thing about them, right? He plays the clarinet, and then all of a sudden, for, let's just say, if not completely unexplained, then poorly or offhandedly, carelessly explained reasons, he just starts playing another instrument. And given the fact that the characterization in Voyager was relatively poor for the most part anyway, it's just an obvious spot to keep hitting whenever I want to take a shot at Voyager and what I consider to be the biggest weakness of Voyager, which is its writing, in particular its ongoing characterization. That's a really obvious soft spot. Yeah, it's low-hanging fruit, but you know the thing about low-hanging fruit is? It's so delicious. Here's one from Doc Holliday. Thank you for doing this. I'm a professional musician and music teacher, so episodes like The Inner Light have an effect on me on a deep personal level. They say you can never listen to music the same way again, and they're right. Learning to play an instrument as a kid changed my relationship to music, and it continues to evolve the longer I play and the more I learn. It can be frustrating not to be able to sit back and just passively listen, but if you allow yourself to go deeper into music, it can be so much more enjoyable and satisfying. Like I say in the video, I can't relate to it exactly because I've never been a musician, but I have done and still do other creative things, so I can relate to it just in a broader sort of sense of being a writer, being a performer, that sort of thing. And what you say specifically about not being able to sit back and just passively listen, I kind of know what you mean from the perspective of someone who watches movies, watches TV shows, and my brain always wants to look at it from the perspective of a writer or a critic and sort of deconstruct it as I'm watching it and go, break it down into the basic elements, be like, oh, why'd he do that instead of that? And he did that, but he should have done that back there instead of there. Or maybe they should have waited and he should have done that a little bit later. Or, oh, that thing that he did a few minutes ago that I didn't like, this would have been a good time to do that instead of back then. Like, my brain just kind of naturally works that way. And I guess I'm lucky that for the most part, it does not keep me from enjoying things because I can still watch something and enjoy it and be taken away by it. If I'm watching something that is really working, that is really touching me on an emotional level or has drawn me in and intrigued me and I'm emotionally invested in it, it still works for me on that level. But I also have this other level on which I can appreciate it. And if it's doing a good job, if it works, and I can see those moving parts, I can see what it's doing in terms of how it's telling its story, and I feel like it's doing a good job or it's doing things in what I would consider to be the right way, that actually enhances my enjoyment of it. And if I'm not enjoying it, and I can see the moving parts and see what's happening and where they're going wrong, that actually at least gives me some level on which, not necessarily to enjoy it, but to engage with it and to help me sort of explain for myself, first and foremost, and for an audience, if I'm going to do a review of it or a video essay about it or whatever, to explain why I don't like it and why I think it's not working. So for me, that's actually been an advantage. And last question from the musical instruments video. This one is from Ms. Maddie YouTube. The name of Picard's instrument is the Resican flute, not simply the Resican. Resican being an adjective denoting the flute as being of Resic. I got so many comments basically that were saying this. It's not the Resican, it's the Resican flute. Okay, so here's the thing. Memory Alpha refers to it as the Resican flute. In the episodes in which the flute is referred to, I do not know of a single time when it is referred to as the Resican flute. It's not referred to by any kind of name in the inner light, at least I don't think it is, but it is referred to a couple of times in the episode Lessons that I also mentioned in that video where Picard and Lieutenant Commander Nella Darren have their romance. And when Darren first sees it, she says, "Oh, what an interesting flute. I've never seen one like it. What is it?" And Picard says, "It's a Resican." And then when Darren is talking about Picard to Dr. Crusher a little bit later, she mentions the flute, and she says, "He plays a kind of flute. I've never seen one before. I think he called it a Resican." So maybe you should tell Captain Picard and Lieutenant Commander Darren in the actual episode that they're incorrectly referring to the flute, and that actually it's not called the Resican like they both call it. It's the Resican flute. Now, these next few comments are from my video that I did a few months ago about whether or not Commander Riker is a womanizer. And this first one is from Katie Schmid, who says, "I adore the framing device you used in this video." You know, my favorite part of the comment section of that video was all the puns about pictures and frames and hanging on the wall and all of that. I love anybody who knows me knows that I consider puns to be maybe not the finest, but one of the finest forms of humor, because I am a fan of low, common, dirty things, and there's nothing lower in terms of comedy than puns. I love them. So I love the puns. So yes, framing device, that was a great one. There's another one too in the next comment that I want to share with you from the Mad Maple. You ask me, Riker was framed at first to basically be Kirk in all but rank, right down to his way with the ladies, but he overcame that portrait viewers had of him, and he eventually was hanged as the serial monogamist we all know and love. Now that is some quality work. Took what Katie did with her comment and framed and just kicked it up, not just one notch, but multiple notches. Or as Emerald himself once said in an episode of Emerald Live that I just happened to be flipping past while looking for something to watch, "Notches unknown." Here's one more from that Riker Womanizer video from Brahmsonite. "No reference to that time Riker was accused of murder and womanizing? Star Trek does Rashomon. The version from the husband's perspective was hilarious." Yes, I really like that episode, but the thing about that episode, especially related to the question of whether or not Riker is a womanizer, is that episode is a whole can of worms that I just didn't think that video had time for or was the appropriate forum for. Because again, as an episode, as a piece of drama, as a riff on Rashomon, as you say, it's terrific. It's a really good episode. But in terms of the way it presents the issue of false sexual assault allegations, or just sexual assault allegations in general, and how they are received and reacted to, and how women are treated when they come forward with sexual assault allegations against a man, and how a man responds when he is accused, and how his friends kind of circle around him and protect him. There's just a lot of really icky, problematic stuff in that episode, and I think I've touched on it before in past videos, and if I talk about it again, I want to sort of make that the purpose or the centerpiece of the video. And I don't know, I just sort of mentioning it as an example in the context of whether or not Riker is a womanizer just doesn't seem right to me, because like I said, that episode, as great as it is as drama, is a whole can of worms in terms of the politics and the underlying issues and the view of sexual assault and what happens when victims come forward and all that stuff. Those are very important issues that our society is still reckoning with. And I don't think the way the episode portrays it is necessarily all that great or all that positive. And that deserves time and focus to unpack that I was not going to be giving it in that video. So that's why I just left it out. Now, these next few comments are from my video about Star Trek Picard Season 2 and what went wrong. And this one is from Whovian for Life. One instance of an actor playing a physically similar character would have been expected, considering Brent Spiner plays every single male Sung the writers come up with. It's like Paramount has a Sung signal on top of their office that they flash after they've created a new one, and Spiner can see it from his house. Spiner installed that Sung signal. Spiner has bugs planted in all the writers' rooms and all the producers' offices for everybody who's even tangentially related to Star Trek. And there's like an AI assistant attached to it. And as soon as it hears anything about Data or lore or one of the Sungs, it triggers that Sung signal on the roof, and Brent Spiner sees it. And he also has a little ring that he wears on his finger that lights up. So if he's not in an area where he can see the sky and he can see the signal in the sky, it also lights up on his ring. He's like, I've been summoned. I need to call my agent. Here's a comment from Velvet Vandal. Your comparison of this show to an open world video game is interesting. It makes me wonder what effect the ubiquity of video games these days has had on other media. Games often emphasize environment over plot and have extremely decompressed storytelling, something you could apply to both the alternate timeline episode and the party infiltration storyline, the latter of which may as well be a Hitman level. I say this as a gamer, by the way. I do think, and I mean, I haven't conducted a study, I have no real direct evidence to back this up. This is just my sense of things, so it's totally subjective, and you may disagree, and I could be completely wrong, but I do feel like the popularity of video games and the mainstreaming of video games over the last 10 or 15 years, where it has become a thing that a lot of people do, and that not only that a lot of people do just as a hobby every now and then, but that a lot of people spend significant time doing and really immerse themselves in games. And the games themselves have become a lot more story-driven and have a lot more time spent in their development on characters and stories, and not just, simple goal-oriented plots that they have to go through, but, sometimes really deep narratives that you become involved in. So I do think that has probably had an influence and is to blame for some of these issues. And I think the key is, when it happens in a video game, you as the player of a video game are taking an active role. So even if you're in a stage of the game that takes a while to get through, and maybe there's not a lot happening in terms of plot or in terms of forward progression of the larger story, you're still actively involved and doing things, and you're just going to be more engaged as an active participant in that story, even if it is kind of slow moving at times, versus when you're sitting on your couch watching an episode of a TV show and there's just nothing happening. Music Cassette says, sometimes when we do role-playing, the characters get a bit unfocused. Often people do things that lead to nothing. And sometimes when too much time goes by, the game master just puts the next plot point in front of the players, whether or not they earned it. I imagine the script is just a session protocol of some role-playing group. So far, that model sufficiently explains all that happened. Yeah, with RPGs as well as with video games, like, you are in the story. You yourself as an individual are playing a character in the story. So you are directly involved. And that's way different than telling a story to an audience that will not be directly involved. Hopefully you can get them emotionally involved. Hopefully you can get them invested in your characters and in the outcome of your story, but they are not actually there participating in it. So that's a big difference. And you have to tell the story in a different way. You can't just be like, well, it'll take a while and, there'll be some stretches where not a whole lot happens, but we can get through it because we're playing the game. That's not how it works. You can't look at it that way. And yeah, I've never played an RPG. I don't have firsthand experience, but the way you describe it, of basically players dicking around and getting lost in their characters and not doing anything towards the goal of the story. So the game master just says, oh, screw it, this is taking forever, and just gives them the next thing to do, even though nothing in the story caused them to have it. Like, that does sound exactly how season 2 of Picard was written, because that kind of stuff happened multiple times throughout that season where characters did nothing to earn the breakthroughs, did nothing to earn the discoveries or the new information or the victories, such as they were, that pushed them into the next thing. Stuff just kind of fell in their lap. And then something else happened. So yeah, that is an incredibly descriptive and accurate way of saying that. Yeah, for sure. These next few comments are from my video about the Klingon characters that we see in classic Trek. This one is from Matt McIrvin. While the TOS Klingons were unambiguously villains, I do think it's important that there was never a time on Star Trek when the stories were just about an unproblematized war to wipe them out. The very first episode with them is the one where the Organians enforce a peace and predict a future of a Federation Klingon alliance. I agree. That is important. And thinking about it takes me back to that video I did a while ago on the question of why do conservatives like Star Trek, or the right-wing Trekkies? What is it about this obviously, blatantly, unapologetically progressive left-leaning franchise that a conservative could possibly like? And it basically boils down to, they missed the intended point of most of it. Because one of the reasons that people cite for conservatives enjoying Star Trek is they say, like, well, there's a lot of military stuff in it. You know, Starfleet is a military, at least a military-ish organization. And there's ranks and structure and hierarchy, and conservatives like that. And, you know, there's war episodes, and there's battle and valor and bravery and patriotism. Like, there's all that stuff that conservatives really get off on. And that's true. But in order to enjoy it the way that a lot of conservatives seem to enjoy it, you have to ignore the fact that Star Trek, as you say, in all of its incarnations, from TOS all the way through the stuff in the Berman era, all the way through the stuff that is being made right now in the Paramount Plus era, it has always been anti-war. Even when it's about war, even in the later seasons of Deep Space Nine, where the war was the big ongoing storyline, it's never been pro-war. It has never glorified war. It's never tried to leave people with the impression that war is a good, positive thing in any way. It's always viewed as something best avoided, as a tragedy, as a failure on the part of one or both sides. It's not a good thing. It's an explicitly and repeatedly and inherently anti-war story. Star Trek as a whole. It's vigorously anti-war. And you really see that in TOS, you know, and you're right. The war between the Klingons are presented as adversaries, and they are presented as representing bad things, and they are meant to stand in for nations that were enemies of the United States at the time, and it turns out are still enemies of the United States, unfortunately. But yeah, the message was never Starfleet must defeat the Klingons, Starfleet must wipe them out and preserve democracy for the galaxy. It was never like that. It was always, war is a terrible thing. These two sides must find a way to coexist in peace, not the good guys have to defeat the bad guys in order for this to work. And yes, I think that is a very important point and a very central point to the message that Star Trek has been trying to send for the last almost 60 years. Here's another one from Will M. Frank. There's nothing a Klingon likes more than a good fight. Koloth should have thanked Scotty for showing his men a grand night out. Koloth is one of my favorite Klingons for exactly that reason. Because, and it's weird because, like, I love Kor and I love Kang because they sort of remind me of the essence of what Klingon characters became later on. You know, you look at Kor and Kang, especially Kang really feels like a modern Klingon, you know, a warrior with a sense of honor, but who really just wants to fight and achieve victory, right? And Kor has some of that as well, but also has sort of the charm and the intellect and the deviousness that we find in General Chang later on, my favorite Klingon, and some other Klingon characters as well. And Koloth just doesn't really fit in anywhere. Koloth doesn't seem like any other important Klingon character that we see later on in Star Trek. And I love that about him because it shows him as a relic of the early days of Star Trek, the relatively early days of Star Trek, when they were just making this stuff up as they went along. And nobody gave a shit about consistency, and nobody gave a shit about world building or the mythology or making sure that this would make sense with that or whatever. They just wrote a part and cast an actor that they thought would do a good job in it, and he played the role of the villain in a comedic episode who was a foil to Captain Kirk, and he played that. And he wasn't worried about, well, gee, I'm a Klingon, how should I be as a Klingon? He put on the costume, he put on the beard, got his hair did. It was like, okay, I'm a Klingon. Now what is my role in this comedic episode? How do I play the foil for the hero, which was Captain Kirk? And he did a great job with it. Doesn't fit in with any of the rest of the Klingons we've ever seen. But that's what I love about it, because it reminds me of that early time in the franchise when it's like, it was the world was their oyster. They could do anything they wanted. They were bound by nothing, and they were just making this stuff up as they went along with no idea that 50 years later people would still be watching it. And there's a thrilling freshness to that I treasure. Here's one more from the Klingons video. This is from Matthew Burdick, 4966. Hey, Steve, I know you're not the biggest fan of Lower Decks, but you're really good friends with Jessie Gender, and she's gotten really close with the cast and creators of the show. If you were given the chance, would you take a minor role or cameo alongside her on Lower Decks? I'm picturing you both as ensigns, Jessie as a chipper Cation, and you as a grumpy Tellarite. I am not a big enough fan of Lower Decks that I would be happy to do a cameo on it for whatever the minimum wage is. Like, if I was going to be on Lower Decks, it would have to be because they were making it worth my while financially. Because I am not a fan of the show. And just the mere opportunity to be on the show, like, that means nothing to me. Like, I that's not enough to get me to do it. So I probably would say no, because again, I wouldn't expect them to want to pay me anything. Why would they? I'm nobody. They should get somebody else to play the role, who is either worth more money or who will do it cheaper, but is a professional, So no, I don't think that would happen. Now, if it was Prodigy, if somehow one of the creators of Prodigy was a fan of mine or was a fan of Jessie's or somehow my name got through the pipeline somehow and they thought, oh, maybe he can do like a line or two for this walk-on character in an episode, let's see if Prodigy I would love, because I'm a huge fan of that show. I would love to be in an episode of Prodigy. They could pay me whatever the going rate is for some nobody recording a line for their show. I wouldn't even question how much they paid me. I would do that to be in the show, and whatever they paid me would be fine. I wouldn't do it for free, because I don't work for free. But I'm sure they wouldn't ask me to do it for free, because they're professionals. But yeah, so Prodigy, completely different story. Prodigy, I'd be like, yeah, fuck yeah, I'll do it. Lower Decks, no. Now, these next few questions are from my video about why Dr. Phlox is the best character on Star Trek Enterprise. And this one is from Mev Page 606. I've had the discussion of which Star Trek doctor would you want as your trans healthcare provider. With many other trans Star Trek fans, Phlox always wins first. He delights in differences. He's empathetic, curious, always eager to learn more, always willing to acknowledge he doesn't know everything, and has limitations. These are traits we wish our own often dogmatic healthcare providers had. I can completely see this. Yeah, I am not trans myself. I've never had to deal with these issues or have to consider, like whether or not my doctor is right for me because they may not respect something about my basic identity. I've never had to deal with that. But when you describe it like that, yeah, I do think Phlox would probably be the most inclusive, the most accepting, and the easiest to work with as far as a trans person needing trans-specific healthcare. Yeah, because you're right. Everything you say about him is right. And that's one of the things that makes him such a wonderful character, is that he does seem like one of the most genuinely open-minded characters that we've ever seen in Star Trek. And he's not written to be a saint, and he's not written to be someone who has all the answers all the time, and he's just like this font of unquestionable wisdom. He does seem to have limitations, and he is fallible, and he does seem to recognize that, at least on some level. He does have some self-awareness. But he just seems wide open and curious, and you know, the spirit of an explorer and a scientist who wants to discover and understand. I think I said in the video, he's like the embodiment of what the mission of the starships in Starfleet is. Like, he is the embodiment of seeking out new worlds and new life and wanting to learn and to grow and to understand. Like, that is a core element of his character. So, of course, he would probably be a great healthcare provider for a trans person. Yeah, it's just another reason why he's not only a great character to watch in a show, but as a person. Like, if he were an actual person, you would think that's probably a pretty good guy. Here's one from Self-Same Synonym 1084. I think the most relatable Phlox moment is actually in similitude. I've made clones to harvest their brains so many times I've lost count, and it's always a struggle to decide whether to kill clone and harvest its brain or heed its desperate pleas for life. I just want everybody to know I got through that first take without cracking up. And I think I deserve a little credit for that. I don't usually stop the video and demand validation and applause, but I read that thing first try, okay, and didn't completely lose it as I dissolved into helpless laughter. And that is an accomplishment, because Self-Same Synonym, that's a goddamn funny comment. Beautiful, beautiful. And good luck in your struggle. I hope that the next clone, you know, gives you an obvious road to go down so you don't have to, you know, take too much time deciding. Hope it's not too agonizing of a decision for you. Depending on which way it goes, it could be agonizing for the clone, but, you know, who cares? Unless you do. Here's one from Kinverse1. I feel like in Phlox, they perfected the sort of jovial wit that Neelix was supposed to have on Voyager. It helps that, in Phlox's case, he is paired with an actual field of competence, something Neelix lacked, which is why he rubbed so many people as obnoxious. And also it helped Phlox that the writers really throttled back on the weirdness, you know, especially after the first episode. Like, in the first episode, you know, they introduced the fact that he has this little menagerie in sickbay, and that was kind of a recurring thing, and that was always a little goofy. And he had like the weird digital smile, you know, but they eased back on the weirdness a lot, so they didn't push that too hard. You know, I think he only did the creepy digital smile like once more, and then there was one episode where he did like the puffing his face out thing. But they saved those things. They didn't just hit you with that kind of thing all the time. So his weirdness didn't become his defining characteristic. It became just one of the many things about him, which I think really, really helped as well. Now, these next few comments are from my video about whether or not Data actually has emotions. And this one is from Timothy Sarabian 5103. I'm actually really surprised that you didn't bring up Data's dedication to his daughter Lal. If you want to think like a computer, the logical thing to do would have been to just deactivate a defective piece of hardware. But Data worked feverishly to try to repair the malfunction. In addition, he was there with her to say goodbye as she slipped away to nothingness. On top of all that, rather than just eliminating the program, he transferred them over to his own positronic brain. I'm sure there are ways to work around that, but for my money, as a father, that is Data having emotions towards his offspring. Yeah, there are ways to work around it. You could chalk it up maybe to his ethical program. He recognizes Lal as a fellow life form, and his ethical program compels him to try and preserve life whenever possible, which is why he tried to save her rather than just deactivating a defective piece of hardware, as you say. But yeah, there's a point that I didn't bring up in the video just for lack of time, but I wanted to actually use as an example the episode from season 7 of TNG, I think it's called Emergence, where an alien entity kind of takes over the Enterprise's computer, and the computer evolves into an artificial intelligence. And there's a discussion in that episode where Data proposes that consciousness and this kind of intelligence that the computer is now demonstrating is an emergent property of living things, that basically it's something that will happen eventually given enough time in the right circumstances. And you could perhaps look at emotional awareness as being a part of that. And you could say that, well, even though Data wasn't designed to have emotions, and even though he's not quote unquote supposed to have them, after living among humans and other emotional beings for so long and learning to emulate their behavior and becoming one of them and forming relationships with them, that after so many years of doing that, he naturally develops the capacity for emotion as an emergent property. And a good piece of evidence to support that is Lal, because even though her developing emotions is depicted as evidence of her malfunction, like she develops emotions because her brain starts to collapse, and it's sort of a signal of the beginning of the end for her, the fact remains she does experience emotion. She does develop an emotional awareness, which means that her positronic brain, which is based on Data's, was capable of feeling emotions, which means you would think that under the right circumstances, Data's would be capable of feeling emotions, and Lal feels her emotions very intensely and struggles to understand it and struggles to articulate what she is feeling, what she is experiencing. So you would imagine that if Data was experiencing the same thing, just at a much lower level of intensity, he might fail to recognize it as what it is at all, or be unable to articulate it in emotional terms, which is something I suggested in the video. So, I think Lal is a great example of that, in addition to just his fatherly behavior toward her. I probably should have mentioned it in the video, but again, the video was about half an hour as it is, and I didn't want it to go on for too long. But it does touch, it ties in with an example that I was thinking about including, but ultimately didn't, about emotion being an emergent property of a conscious being. Here's one from Aaron Hess, 7781. I think Data's relationship with Spot is the best case for him having emotions pre-emotion chip. That is an interesting observation. And, if you think about it, there's really no non-emotional reason to keep a pet like a cat or a dog, right? Maybe a dog, because you can say, well, you can keep a dog for protection. A dog can alert you to things that maybe you don't know about. But barring that, like, the reason people have dogs and the reason people have cats aren't because cats and dogs perform any service for them. They don't do any labor, they're not like farm animals. They aren't livestock. They don't produce products that we use in our lives. If anything, they're a drain on our financial and physical resources. We have dogs and cats because we love them and because we enjoy spending time with them and doing things with them. And we enjoy taking care of them. And they give us love back. They snuggle with us and they lick our faces and they jump around and play with us. And they greet us when we come home and they snuggle with us when we're on the couch. And they form these relationships with us that are based on a sort of mutual need. And there is no, at least as far as I can see and as far as I can figure it, there's no non-emotional reason to do that. Because other than emotional support and an emotional outlet, someone to give your love to and someone to receive love from, there's no reason to have a cat, especially a cat. There's no reason to have a cat other than to love the cat and to have the cat love you back. That's the only reason. So Data having a cat, yes, again, you could always chalk anything that he does up to, well, he sees that humans have cats or humans have pets, and he wants to have that experience because he wants to know what it's like to be a human and to have a pet. But there's no unemotional reason to have a cat, And Data has a cat. Data chooses to have a cat. And he looks like from what we can tell, he's a pretty good cat daddy. He takes good care of Spot, and he shows Spot love and affection, at least what appear to be love and affection. So yeah, I think Data having a cat and being such a good cat owner could potentially be evidence that he has emotions before the emotion chip, for sure. Here's one from Patricia Mercer, 7632. There is a condition that I just read about called alexithymia, a sort of emotional colorblindness where you have emotions but can't really identify them. I had never heard of this before, but several people brought it up in the comments to that video, so I wanted to make sure to mention it here as well because it was so frequently referred to. And I looked it up myself on Wikipedia, just, very superficial level of research. And it does sound a lot like Data. Lack of awareness of emotions, difficulty in describing emotional states, difficulty in speaking in emotional language, like that sounds like Data. So I don't think that the writers of Star Trek had that in mind when they wrote the character. I think that's something that we are projecting onto it, that we are bringing to it through our interpretation. But that doesn't mean that's not valid, But no, I don't think the writers of Star Trek TNG were like, I think Data should be written as though he has alexithymia. Like, I don't think that was ever in anybody's mind. But I do think it is a valid interpretation, and if you map it onto Data, it fits pretty well. Now, these next few comments are from my video about Captain Pike, and this first one is from Restum Salucard, who says, watching Strange New Worlds inspired me to rewatch The Menagerie from the original series, and even in the beep chair, I can see some of the characterization from Mount in this Pike, particularly in the fact that TOS Pike absolutely refuses to cooperate with Spock's plan, beeping no after no in protest, because it would mean risking Spock's career in Starfleet and even his life if he is found guilty by the court-martial. Even after all he went through and all the pain he continues to suffer, he is still willing to sacrifice his own well-being for the good of his crew and for the safety of his friend. I think it may be an example of really excellent retroactive characterization on the part of the writers who are writing Pike now in Strange New Worlds, because what could have happened, and I don't know if this is what happened or if it was intentional, but yeah, that little glimpse of Pike's character that we see in The Menagerie, where he does not want to go along with it, he does not want Spock to risk himself for Pike's own good. They could have taken that and said, this is an insight into this man's character. He seems like a really selfless, good person. That and the fact that he got the injuries in the first place trying to help cadets, get out of the way and escape the explosion. So, okay, who is this guy? Like, what kind of guy would do that? What kind of person would he be? And they built the Pike that we know from Discovery and Strange New Worlds out of that. That could very easily have been the case. I don't know if it was or not, but the important thing is the Pike that we have today fits that. You're absolutely right. Our Pike from Strange New Worlds seems exactly like the kind of guy who would do that. It's consistent, even though it's different in a lot of ways. Especially from the Jeffrey Hunter version from The Cage, there's a consistency emotionally and in terms of his morals and his character that carries through. And I think that's a really nice piece of writing that. Tom Harrison, 1393, very much expected to hear you say, then Voyager debuted, and fans were then faced with the question, who's your favorite captain, Kirk, Picard, or Sisko? See, this is that thing that happens every so often when I do these comment videos where it's like, it's the simultaneous emotional peak and valley of a viewer of the video writing a better joke than the one I wrote for the video. It's like, I feel pride that I have such clever, funny people watching my videos. And then I feel just a deep, gnawing shame that I didn't come up with it myself. So congratulations, and how dare you. Here's one from Tay. I wonder if you could do Nana Visitor or Sirach Lofton's podcasts. Oh, I assure you I could. I mean, it's kind of up to them to invite me. I don't think I would be welcome just crashing like the Zoom call or however they do it. But, I assure you if invited, I could. Yes, very much so. And here's one from Captain Pikachu. I still don't think Discovery gets enough credit for the work its writers did in crafting Pike's character in such a perfect way and setting such a strong foundation for SNW to continue and taking a character that was doomed to be a footnote in Trek history and turning him into the shining star of this franchise. There really is no this version of Pike that we love or Strange New Worlds without the hard work of Disco. I could not agree more. I think that is something that needs to be brought up again and again when you encounter people who are really strident about their dislike of Discovery, but hold up Strange New Worlds as an example of how it should be done. Because look, I have never thought and never said that Discovery is a perfect show. Discovery has never been a perfect show. I like Discovery. When Discovery is hitting on all cylinders, it can be great. But it's not always like that. There are a lot of ups and downs with Discovery, and there have been from the very beginning. But however you feel about Discovery, if you love Strange New Worlds, and if you love this version of Captain Pike, you cannot, in all fairness, you cannot discount Discovery in that, because the writers of Discovery, that show that so many people hate and despise and deride and just want to throw out the window and pretend it doesn't even exist. And they talk about the people that create Discovery like they don't know anything about Star Trek. They've never even watched the show. They made everything look different and they changed the Klingons and none of this makes sense with the established history and blah, 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 blah. And you can tell they don't even want to do Star Trek. They just want to do some generic sci-fi show. Blah, 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 right? All the anti-Discovery stuff. The people who wrote that show, who are writing that show, that you have no respect for, you think don't get Star Trek, that you hate, they basically created this version of Captain Pike. Because like I said in response to the earlier question, there was perhaps some kernel of the version of Pike from the cage and from the menagerie that they could have taken as a starting point. But that's all it was. Captain Pike, the prime timeline Captain Pike, because, there's also the Bruce Greenwood version that is sort of very similar, but off there in his own corner of the universe doing his own thing. This version of Captain Pike, the prime timeline classic Trek Captain Pike, before season 2 of Discovery, he really only existed in one episode, The Cage, which was then repurposed for the menagerie, and just the little bit of new Captain Pike stuff with him in the beep chair in the menagerie. So we're really talking about one episode and a little bit extra, right? That's all there was. So the Captain Pike that Anson Mount is playing, beginning with Discovery Season 2, is essentially a completely new character. And that character was created by the writers of Star Trek Discovery. And by Anson Mount through his incredible performance, but fundamentally, on the page, it's created by the writers of Star Trek Discovery. So if you love Captain Pike, and you love Strange New Worlds, but you hate Discovery, just remember, that show you love, and specifically that character that leads that show you love, owe their existence to the people who write that other show over there that you think is just absolutely the shits. I think that needs to be pointed out, and I think the role of the writers of Discovery and that whole second season of Discovery needs to be given the credit that it deserves. Or if you feel that Strange New Worlds is the first time that they've really gotten it right, and that it's the first of the new shows that deserves to be called Star Trek, and is a deserving part of that legacy and all that stuff like that, that's fine. But if you love this, it's not fair to completely discount Discovery, because Discovery made that. The people who made Discovery made this show possible, because they created that Captain Pike. And I do think that is important to point out and keep pointing out. And finally, these last few questions are from my video about Star Trek Prodigy. This one is from Langley M. Neely. When describing Prodigy to people for the first time, I referred to it as the Batman the Animated Series for Star Trek. It's kid family friendly, but takes the universe and lore seriously enough that it's welcoming for longtime veteran Trek fans. I was pleasantly surprised that Prodigy would be the best new Trek series for me. I love Strange New Worlds, and I think it's a stellar first season, but I have to give the edge to Prodigy. It's that good. I am right there with you. I mean, I would give Strange New Worlds the edge over Prodigy, but as you can tell from that video, I love Prodigy to death. I was incredibly impressed by it, and I too was very surprised. I did not expect a animated show aimed at a young audience to hit so hard with me, but I was just blown away by how great it was. And yeah, I would never have thought to describe it as being like Batman the Animated Series, but I think that's a really perfect way to describe it. There are differences, obviously, like Batman the Animated Series there's the larger sort of Batman mythos that it exists in, but the actual fictional world that was created with Batman the Animated Series was a new version of Batman that we had seen other versions of. Whereas Prodigy orients itself within the established fiction of Star Trek. It's just a different corner of that universe. It's a different story within that framework. So it's different from Batman the Animated Series in that sense. But thematically, emotionally, in terms of the way it treats the established canon of Star Trek, the way it takes ideas that we see other versions of in earlier Star Trek shows and brings them up and does something new and different with them, but in a way that is familiar and is in line with what other Star Trek shows and movies have done with those ideas in the past. Just as Batman the Animated Series sort of synthesized and stripped down a lot of the elements of Batman and presented them in a way that was both familiar but also new and accessible. Yeah, I never would have made that connection myself, but I think that is a really perfect way to describe it. It is definitely doing for Star Trek very much the same sort of thing that Batman the Animated Series did for Batman. Here's one from Sarah Scott, who says, I love this series so much. One of the best new Trek series. Who would have thought such a loving homage to Voyager would turn out to be potentially even better than Voyager? I think we can take the potentially out of there already, Sarah. From my perspective. Not from yours, but from mine. And, it's funny. Sometimes people will say, I got another comment. I can't remember if it was a comment on that video or if it was someone responding to me on Twitter, but somebody said something like, boy, it's really cool to see that Steve loves Prodigy so much when he's always so hard on Voyager. And I guess you can look at Prodigy as like a successor series to Voyager in certain ways because it does start out in the Delta Quadrant and Janeway is in it and Chakotay is part of it in sort of a backstory kind of way. I mean, there are elements from Voyager. There are certain pieces from Voyager that are picked up and used and incorporated into Prodigy. But that's really it. Like the show itself, in terms of the story and the tone and especially the writing and the storytelling and the characterization, it doesn't strike me as being like Voyager at all or being a product of or a continuation of Voyager in any way. So I think it's interesting that people view it that way. And I guess, it's an obvious point to make because Janeway's in it and Chakotay's in it and it has to do with the Delta Quadrant. Like I don't question why people view it that way, but I will say until someone pointed that out, it never occurred to me. Even with the presence of Janeway as a regular character. Like it never occurred to me that this show could be viewed as any sort of a continuation of Voyager or like a child of Voyager. It never occurred to me because it's so much better. And it is so good at so many of the things that Voyager was usually so bad at. So it honestly never occurred to me that like, oh, this is kind of like Voyager. No, I get it now that people have pointed it out, but I never got that while I was watching it. And I think in my case, that is very much a compliment to the show. And finally, from Weasel, all the stuff you said about Prodigy sticking the landing, courage, selflessness, sacrifice, triumph, sadness, the recognition that change is inevitable but not always comfortable, and the promise that adventure is always out there, you're actually describing Lower Decks, right? Okay, you seem to be talking about Lower Decks the way that Dave Filoni talks about the Star Wars prequels, which is you are describing things that you have imagined in your mind that do not actually exist for other people to see. Like, you ever see that interview with Dave Filoni where he's talking about the Star Wars prequels and how meaningful they are and all the things that they have to say about characters. And it's like, and it sounds like he's talking about completely different movies than the ones everybody else saw. It's like, what? You're like, he's adding a lot to it, and he's bringing a lot of his own stuff to it to make it make sense and to give it a lot more depth and a lot more resonance than it actually has. I feel like that's kind of what you're doing with Lower Decks there. Because when I've seen every episode of Lower Decks. Courage, selflessness, sacrifice, triumph, sadness, the recognition that change is inevitable but not always comfortable. That's certainly not the show I have seen when I've watched Lower Decks. I guess, but if that is the show that you have seen, then maybe I should have taken one extra step to separate Prodigy from Lower Decks and also said, in addition to all of that, it's also really funny and has great jokes. Because then you would know that I wasn't talking about Lower Decks. See, I try. Oh, if you knew how I tried. I don't want to just dump on Lower Decks because I know a lot of my friends love it and a lot of my fellow Trekkies, whether we're acquainted personally or not, really like it. I don't get it, but it brings joy to a lot of people, so I don't just want to shit on it, I don't want to just tear it apart and just say negative things about it because, like, a lot of people really love it, and the people who make it, who write it, and the voice cast, like, they seem like good people. I don't want to, rain on their parade. Like, I don't want to do this. You make me do this. You drag me down to this. You give me no choice. I try. And every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. Anyway, so not only do you, the viewers, through your comments, help me to write these videos, but you also have now apparently taken responsibility for some of my actions as well. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. That's the last comment. That's all I'm going to respond to. Thank you all so much for sitting through this. If you have watched this entire thing, I have no idea how long this video is going to wind up being, but it's probably going to be pretty long. So if you watched the entire thing, thank you so much. I really, really, really appreciate it. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for watching my videos just in general. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/SteveShives, or becoming a channel member by clicking the join link, or by giving a one-time donation. If doing like a regular monthly contribution isn't something you want to commit to, you can give a one-time donation through the thanks button or via PayPal or Venmo. Links to all of those are in the description. Thanks once again for watching and for the comments. I will see you again soon with more Star Trek related stuff and more videos about other stuff that has nothing to do with Star Trek that hopefully some of you will watch as well. Until next time, take care, everybody.